The envelope had been sitting in a cardboard box in my own garage for almost a year, and if it had rained one more time that spring, I might never have opened it. The box was pushed up against the wall where the water always seeped in, and another storm would have turned it to pulp. Instead, the roof held, the box stayed dry, and on an ordinary Tuesday in March, I reached in to clear out old paperwork before a garage sale, and my hand closed around a single unopened bank statement addressed to my husband, from a bank we did not use. I almost tossed it in the recycling. I want you to understand how close I came. It was junk drawer paper, the kind of thing you throw out 100 times without thinking, but something made me stop. The bank's name. I'd never heard of it, and after 24 years of running military supply operations, I have a very particular relationship with paperwork that doesn't belong where it's found. So I slid it open with my thumbnail, standing there in the cold garage with dust on my hands, and I read the balance. And I read the account holder's name, and then I read the second name on the account, the joint account holder, and the garage went very quiet around me, and I understood that the marriage I thought I'd been living in for 22 years had never really existed at all. But let me back up, because the story of how a retired Army officer found the end of her marriage in a water-stained cardboard box doesn't start in that garage. It starts 3 years earlier, with a man who was a little too eager to handle all the money, and a wife who was a little too willing to let him, and who told herself, the way we all do, that trust meant never looking too closely. My name is Susan Reyes. I'm 52 years old, and I spent 24 years in the United States Army as a supply and logistics officer, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. My war was fought with manifests and convoy schedules and the unglamorous life-or-death math of making sure that the people downrange had fuel, ammunition, medicine, and food before they knew they needed it. I was good at it. I built a career on a single, unshakable habit. When a number doesn't add up, you don't explain it away. You find the missing piece. That habit kept soldiers alive for 2 decades. It's also, it turns out, the only reason I'm not still living inside my husband's lie. I met Gerald about a year after I retired. I was still figuring out who I was without a uniform. That's a harder transition than people realize, going from a life where every hour has a purpose to a quiet house and an open calendar. Gerald filled the quiet. He was warm and attentive, the kind of man who remembered how you took your coffee and had it waiting. He'd built a small but successful HVAC company across a couple of counties in Arizona, and he carried himself like a man who had his life in order. On our 3rd date, he told me he admired that I'd served, that he could tell I was someone who finished what she started. I believed him. After a career of being seen mostly as a rank, I wanted very badly to be seen as a woman. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony outside Tucson. My daughter from my first marriage, Marisol, was 22 then and gave me away, and she cried harder than I did. Gerald had no children of his own. He told me Marisol and I were the family he'd waited his whole life for. For a long time, I believed that too. Here's the thing I've had to sit with since. The warning signs were never loud. They never are. If betrayal announced itself, none of us would ever fall for it. The signs were small, and each one had a reasonable explanation, and I supplied every explanation myself. The first was the money. Early in our marriage, Gerald gently took over all our finances. It made sense at the time. He ran a business, he understood accounts and taxes, and I'd spent my whole adult life letting the Army handle my pay. "You've earned a break from paperwork," he told me, and he laughed, and I handed it all over. Bills, statements, the joint accounts, my pension deposits. He set everything to paperless. "Saves the clutter," he said. I agreed without thinking. I've thought about that decision 1,000 times since. The second sign was his mother, Delia. She was 70, sharp-eyed, and she had decided before she met me that I wasn't right for her son. Her cruelty was the quiet kind. "It must be nice," she'd say at dinner, To have a military pension just arrive every month, whether you do anything or not. Little cuts, always delivered with a smile. Gerald never defended me. He'd just sigh and say, "That's just how Mom is." I learned to pass the potatoes and say nothing. The third sign was the one I should have seen, and it came about 2 years in. Gerald began traveling more for business. Overnight trips that hadn't existed before. He grew cooler at home, more impatient with Marisol, quicker to disappear into his phone. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd tell me I was imagining things, that retirement had made me anxious, that I needed a hobby. And slowly, this is the part that's hardest to admit, I started to believe there was something wrong with me. That's how it works. They don't just lie to you, they convince you that your own eyes are the problem. For a woman who'd spent 24 years trusting her own judgment under fire, letting someone teach me to distrust it in my own home was the great failure of my life. And I let it happen one small, reasonable-sounding compromise at a time. Which brings me back to the garage, and the box, and the unopened statement. The account was at an online bank neither Gerald nor I had ever mentioned to each other. The primary holder was Gerald, and the second name on the account, the joint holder, was a woman named Catherine Voss. I stood there holding it, and I did the math I did not want to do. Catherine Voss was the office manager Gerald had hired for his company about 3 years earlier. I'd met her twice, pleasant, professional, always laughing at Gerald's jokes at the company Christmas party. I'd thought nothing of her, and here was her name, joined to my husband's, on a bank account I'd never heard of, holding a balance of just over $86,000. The statement was nearly a year old, which meant this account, whatever it was, had existed for at least a year, probably longer, hidden inside a marriage where I wasn't allowed to see so much as an electric bill anymore. I did not go inside and confront him. I want to be clear about that, because I think most people imagine they'd storm into the house and throw the paper in his face. 24 years in the army teaches you something different. When you discover you've walked into an ambush, the worst thing you can do is fire wildly. You go quiet, you assess, you secure your position, and you gather intelligence before the enemy knows you're aware of anything at all. So I photographed the statement, front and back, every line. I emailed the photos to a personal account Gerald didn't have the password to. Then I put the statement back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the box, put the box back exactly where I'd found it, against the damp wall, and I went inside and made dinner and asked my husband about his day. He told me about a difficult install out in Marana. I told him the chicken needed 5 more minutes, and the whole time my mind was moving very, very fast. Because I understood, standing at that stove, that I had 2 problems, and they were tangled together. One was a marriage that was clearly over. The other was $86,000, and a bank I'd never heard of, and a woman whose name was on it, and the growing cold certainty that if there was one hidden account, there were almost certainly more. And I had let this man control every dollar we owned for years. That night, after Gerald was asleep, I lay awake and made a decision. I was not going to react. I was not going to rage. I was going to do the one thing I had spent my whole career doing better than almost anyone. I was going to follow the numbers until they told me the whole truth. The next morning, after Gerald left for the office, I made 2 calls. The first was to my daughter Marisol, who was 28 now and worked as an accountant in Phoenix, which I would come to realize was not luck but something closer to grace. I told her what I'd found. There was a long silence on the line, and then her voice came back, and it had changed. It had gone precise and careful, the voice she used for work. "Mom," she said, "don't touch anything else. Don't move money, don't close anything, don't tip him off. But I want you to find every piece of financial paper in that house that you can, and I want you to photograph all of it. I'll help you make sense of it. This is literally what I do for a living." "Marisol," I said, "I'm scared of what we're going to find." "I know," she said, But you already found the worst part, Mom. Everything after this is just proof. The second call was to a family law attorney, a woman named Frances Alvarez, recommended through the legal assistance office I'd earned access to over 24 years and never once used. Her office was small and cluttered, files stacked on every surface, a coffee maker that had clearly survived a decade of hard mornings. She was maybe 60, silver-haired and unhurried in a way that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like the ground was solid. She listened to my whole story without interrupting once. When I finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them down. Susan, I've done family law for 31 years, and I'm going to tell you two things. The first is that discovering a hidden joint account with another person's name on it is not the end of your investigation. It is the beginning. Men who hide one account almost always hide several, because the first one teaches them they can. What you've found is a thread. We're going to pull it, carefully, and we're going to see how much unravels. And the second thing? She leaned forward. The second thing is that you have an advantage most of my clients don't. You spent a career finding things that were deliberately hidden inside mountains of paperwork. Your husband thinks he's dealing with a wife who never looked at a bank statement. He has no idea he's dealing with a logistics officer. A small smile. We're not going to beat him with anger. We're going to beat him with the paper trail. Anger fades by morning. The paper trail is still sitting there when the sun comes up. Over the next several weeks, I did what I'd done for a living. I gathered facts. Frances was scrupulous about the rules, and she drilled them into me. I was not to hack anything, not to access accounts that weren't mine, not to do a single thing that crossed a line. We win this clean, she said, or we hand him the one weapon he doesn't currently have, the ability to say you're the one who behaved badly. So we worked with what was legitimately mine to see, and with what the legal process could later compel. And it turned out that an enormous amount of the truth was already within my reach, if I knew where to look. This was the lesson that changed everything for me. People who hide things believe they've hidden them completely, but the truth leaves fingerprints everywhere. Our joint tax returns, which I had signed for years without reading, held clues once I actually read them. The public business filings for Gerald's company were available to anyone. Credit card statements came addressed to both of us on cards I was a signer on. And the house itself was full of paper, because for all his carefulness, Gerald was a creature of habit, and habit is the enemy of a man keeping secrets. I found the filing cabinet key taped under the middle desk drawer in his home office, the same hiding spot he'd used for a decade. Inside, I did what I used to do with a supply discrepancy. I pulled every folder, and I laid the documents out across the floor in order, by date, and I built a timeline. And slowly, the way fog burns off a field at dawn, the true shape of my marriage came into focus. The joint account with Catherine Voss was not the only one. There were two others I found traces of. Money moving in careful, unremarkable increments, the kind of transfers designed to slip past a wife who'd been trained not to look. Over roughly 3 years, something on the order of $200,000 had moved out of our joint finances and into accounts I'd never been told about. Some of it, I could see, had funded a lifestyle I hadn't been part of, charges at restaurants I'd never eaten at, a hotel in Sedona for a weekend Gerald had told me was a trade conference, a jewelry store in Scottsdale where I had certainly never received anything. And then I found the piece that turned my stomach cold. Tucked into a folder labeled, of all things, warranties, where it plainly did not belong, was a copy of a document, the operating agreement for a company called Voss Reyes Holdings, LLC. My husband and Catherine Voss had formed a business together, capitalized with money that had come out of my marriage. And on the second page of that agreement, buried in dense legal language, was a clause stating that in the event of Gerald's divorce, his interest in the company and all assets contributed to it would be maintained as separate property, beyond the reach of marital claims. The agreement had been signed 2 years earlier, 2 years before I ever found that statement in the garage, my husband had been planning, methodically, for a divorce he hadn't yet told me was coming, building a hidden company with another woman, funding it with our savings, and writing the legal language to keep me from ever touching it. I photographed every page. I emailed everything to the account he couldn't reach, and I put it all back exactly where I'd found it, in exactly the same order, and retaped the key under the drawer. Then I sat on the floor of that office for a long time, surrounded by the ghost of my own marriage, and I did not cry. I'd used up my crying, I think, back in the garage. What I felt instead was that old, familiar clarity, the feeling I used to get when a chaotic situation finally resolved into a problem I could actually solve. There was one more thing I found that day, and it was the smallest thing, and it was the one that hurt the most. In the same drawer, under the folders, was a receipt. A dinner receipt from a steakhouse in Scottsdale, dated on our wedding anniversary 2 years earlier. I remembered that night. Gerald had told me he was stuck on an emergency call, a commercial unit that had gone down, and that he was sorry, and that we'd celebrate the following weekend, which we never did, because something always came up. I had spent our anniversary that year eating leftover pasta alone at the kitchen counter, telling myself I'd married a hard-working man, feeling guilty for even being disappointed, and here was the receipt. 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, a dessert to share. He hadn't been on an emergency call. He'd been at dinner, just not with me. I want to tell you that the money was the worst part. The $200,000, the hidden company, the years of planning, but it wasn't. The worst part was a dinner receipt for 2 on an anniversary I'd spent alone, because that receipt was the moment I understood that the lie hadn't just been about money, it had been about time. About my life. About every night I'd sat home believing a story he'd written for me while he lived a completely different one an hour up the highway. Money you can claw back. Francis proved that. But nobody was ever going to give me back that anniversary, or the 2 years of them. I put the receipt back with the rest. I didn't need it as evidence. Francis told me later it wasn't legally useful, but I've never forgotten it. Sometimes, when I catch myself softening toward the memory of my marriage, wondering if maybe I'm being too hard on the man, I think about that receipt, and the softness passes, and I'm grateful all over again that I opened the box. I brought all of it to Marisol and Francis, and I watched their faces as they went through it. Marisol, my careful daughter, went pale and then furious in the quiet way she has. She traced the transfers with a pencil, node to node, the way an accountant does, and when she was done she looked up and said, "Mom, this isn't just an affair and some hidden money. This is structured. He built a system. This took years." Francis nodded slowly and said the words that reframed the whole thing. "This isn't infidelity with a financial footnote. This is a man who committed a long, deliberate fraud against his own wife. And the difference matters enormously, because a judge forgives a broken heart, but a judge does not forgive a man who lies under oath about where the money went." Unquote. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and I won't pretend otherwise. I lived 2 separate lives inside one house. In one, I was Susan the wife, tired, a little withdrawn, exactly the woman Gerald expected. I made dinner. I asked about his installs. I let him believe I was still the person who never looked at a bank statement, who'd handed him the finances years ago and never asked a question since. It was the hardest acting I've ever done, harder than any briefing I ever gave to a general, because every night I sat across the table from a man I now knew had spent 2 years planning to leave me destitute, and I passed him the salt and asked if he wanted more rice. In the other life, the real one, I was an officer running an operation. Francis filed the groundwork quietly. Marisol built a forensic timeline of every dollar, and I kept doing what I did best, finding the pieces that didn't belong. There were hard nights. There were moments the loneliness of it nearly broke me. The specific loneliness of lying next to someone who has already left, who is just waiting for the right moment to make it official on his terms. There were moments I looked at old photographs, our wedding, a trip to the coast, and had to remind myself that the man in them had been building the lie, even as the pictures were taken. And there was the harder grief underneath all of it, the grief of realizing how much of myself I'd surrendered, how completely I'd let someone talk me out of my own instincts, how a woman who'd commanded soldiers had let herself be managed like a child in her own kitchen. But something shifted in me during those weeks too. With every document I found, with every transfer Marisol traced, I felt myself coming back. Not the wife Gerald had slowly diminished, the officer, the woman who found the missing piece. I'd wake up before dawn out of old habit, make coffee in the dark, and work through the paper, and for the first time in years I felt like myself again. It's a strange thing to say, but discovering the worst truth of my life is what gave me back to myself. Marisol drove down from Phoenix most weekends during those weeks, under the cover story that she was helping me plan the garage sale that had started all of this. Gerald never questioned it. A mother and daughter sorting through old boxes was exactly the kind of thing he'd stopped paying attention to years ago, and his blindness to us was, by then, working entirely in our favor. We'd set up at the kitchen table with the laptop and a legal pad, and to anyone glancing in we were pricing old dishes. In reality, Marisol was walking me through the anatomy of what her father had built, and I was teaching her, in return, how I'd learned to read a hostile system, how you look not at the numbers that are there, but at the shape of the space where a number should be and isn't. One of those evenings, Gerald came home early. We heard the garage door, and Marisol closed the laptop in one smooth motion and had a stack of coffee mugs in front of her before he reached the kitchen. "Still at it?" he said, loosening his tie, glancing at the mugs. "You two could sell all this junk online in an afternoon." Marisol smiled at him. My careful, furious daughter smiled at her father like nothing in the world was wrong, and said, "You know, Mom, she likes to do things properly." And Gerald laughed, and agreed, and went to change out of his work clothes, and never knew that his wife and his stepdaughter had just spent 2 hours mapping the exact architecture of his betrayal at his own kitchen table. When he was gone, Marisol looked at me, and neither of us said anything, but I saw in her face the same thing I was feeling, a kind of grim, quiet pride that we were, the two of us, so much better at this than he had ever imagined. Then, about 6 weeks in, 2 things happened close together. The first was that Marisol found the bottom of it. Working from the tax returns and the account traces, she identified the full scope. Not $200,000, but closer to $260,000, moved over 3 years, plus the equity Gerald had pulled from a refinance on our house, a house my pension and my savings had paid down, and funneled into Voss Reyes Holdings. She laid it out for me on her laptop, a clean spreadsheet, every dollar accounted for, and she said quietly, "This is everything, Mom. This is the whole picture." And seeing it all in one place, in my daughter's careful columns, was somehow both the worst and the most freeing moment of the entire year. The second thing was that Gerald filed for divorce. He didn't tell me to my face. I came home from the grocery store and there was an envelope on the kitchen counter, next to the fruit bowl, his lawyer's return address in the corner, inside the petition, and a proposed settlement that was almost breathtaking in its nerve. It offered me the clean and simple division. I keep my car, my personal belongings, and my military pension. Gerald keeps the house, tied up in the business, the papers said, and his company. Sign here, and here, and here, and we can do this like adults, no lawyers dragging it out. He'd timed it, I realized, to catch me overwhelmed. He had no idea I'd spent 6 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. That night I called Frances, and I read her the settlement over the phone, and when I finished there was a pause, and then she laughed. A short, dry, delighted laugh. "Susan," she said, "he just made the last mistake he's going to make. He's put his lowball offer in writing, in his own lawyer's language, before he knows we can prove the hidden company and the missing $250,000. When we walk into that mediation, we're going to have his offer in one hand and the truth in the other. And the gap between them is going to be the most expensive thing that man has ever seen. The mediation was set for a Thursday morning in a conference room downtown. Gerald drove us both, which was surreal, the two of us in the same car, headed to the end of our marriage, him humming along to the radio, relaxed, certain. He thought this was his victory lap. His lawyer was a slick man named Preston in an expensive suit who shook my hand a little too firmly. Catherine Voss was not there, of course, but her name was about to fill that room. Gerald sat beside Preston, comfortable. Frances sat beside me, unhurried, and pulled a single worn leather folder out of her bag. Preston did most of the early talking. He walked through the settlement page by page in that smooth mediation voice, describing it as fair, generous even, a clean parting between two reasonable adults. He slid the pages toward me. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I found the signature line. And Frances said gently, "Susan, let's not sign that just yet." The room shifted. Preston's smile flickered. Gerald frowned. "Frances," Preston said smoothly, "we've been over everything. It's a standard." "It's not standard," Frances said, and she opened her folder. She wasn't loud. She never once got loud that whole morning. She simply began laying documents on the table, one at a time, the way you deal cards. "This settlement transfers the marital residence and the business to Mr. Reyes as separate property," she said. "But the residence was refinanced 2 years ago, and the equity pulled from it, equity that came substantially from my client's pension and savings, was transferred into an entity called Voss Reyes Holdings, LLC. She placed the refinance records down. A company Mr. Reyes co-owns with Ms. Catherine Voss." Gerald's face changed, just slightly, but I'd been married to him for 22 years, and I knew that flicker. Preston recovered fast. "Business holdings aren't unusual. There's nothing improper about." "I agree," Frances said pleasantly. "Which is why I'm certain Mr. Reyes disclosed this company and these 3 additional bank accounts in his sworn preliminary financial disclosure." She looked at Preston with something like kindness. "Did he?" Preston hesitated. It was only a second, but a second is a very long time in a room like that. And he looked at Gerald. Gerald was staring at the table. And then Frances laid down the rest, unhurried, 1 page at a time. The statement from the garage, the one that started it all. The 2 other hidden accounts Marisol had traced. The transfers, 3 years of them, mapped out in my daughter's clean columns. And finally the operating agreement, page 2, the clause. "This clause," Frances said, "specifically structures the company so that the equity from the marital home would be, and I'm quoting, maintained as separate property, beyond the reach of marital claims, in the event of Mr. Reyes's divorce." It was signed 2 years ago. She let that sit in the silence. 2 years before Mr. Reyes filed the petition he brought to this table today, as a spontaneous, amicable parting, which means the divorce he's presenting as a clean and simple decision was being financially engineered, in secret, for years. The room had gone completely silent. I could hear the building's air handling system, a soft rush somewhere overhead. Preston leaned over and whispered something sharp to Gerald. Gerald whispered back, fast and low. Then Preston straightened, and in a voice that had lost every bit of its polish, he said, "I'm going to need a few minutes alone with my client." "Of course," Frances said, and she began gathering her papers with the calm of a woman who had all the time in the world. They stepped out. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see them in the hallway, Preston talking fast, Gerald's arms crossed, his jaw tight. At one point, Gerald looked back through the glass, at me, and for the first time since I'd found that statement in the garage, he didn't look confident. He looked like a man doing arithmetic and not liking the sum. Francis leaned toward me and said quietly, "You did the hard part months ago. In that garage. This is just the accounting. I won't dramatize the rest, because the truth was more powerful than any drama could have been. It was methodical, and methodical was devastating." When they came back in, the whole tone had changed. Preston started talking about revisiting the asset division and correcting some oversights. Gerald wouldn't look at me, but the case was no longer his to shape. Once the hidden company and the concealed accounts were on the table, and once it was clear Gerald had failed to disclose them under oath, the ground had moved entirely. The matter didn't fully resolve that morning, of course. Real life isn't a movie. It took months more of discovery, of Marisol's spreadsheets being validated by a forensic accountant, of Gerald's lawyers fighting and then fighting less and then barely fighting at all. But the outcome was written the moment Francis laid down page 2. The court found that every dollar Gerald had moved into Voss Reyes Holdings was marital property that could not be shielded by the operating agreements clause. The home equity was clawed back into the marital estate. The hidden accounts were divided because Gerald had concealed the company and the accounts in his sworn disclosures, because he had, in the plain language of the court, committed a fraud on the process. The judge weighted the final settlement heavily in my favor and ordered him to cover a substantial share of my legal costs. I did not get everything. Frances told me early that everything is the wrong goal, and by the end I understood her. What I got was fair, which was the one thing Gerald had used as a weapon and never actually meant. Catherine Voss, it turned out, hadn't fully understood what Gerald had done either. When the records came to light, she learned that a good deal of the money he'd told her was his own had in fact come out of his marriage, my pension, my savings, the equity in my home. Their partnership, in business and otherwise, did not survive discovery. I won't pretend I was sorry. But I also stopped thinking about her almost entirely. She wasn't my battle. She never had been. Gerald's mother, Delia, never apologized. When the story spread through the family, I heard she told people I'd torn everything apart out of spite. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't care. She wasn't my battle either. I'd spent enough of my life passing the potatoes and swallowing her little cuts. I was done doing it, and being done felt like setting down a heavy pack at the end of a long march. Gerald called me once, a few months after everything was finalized. It was late, and his voice was small, none of the old ease in it. "I convinced myself you'd never look," he said. "You never looked before." And that, right there, was the truest thing he ever said to me. "I know," I told him. "That was the mistake, Gerald. Not that I finally looked, that you built your whole life on the belief that I never would." I wasn't angry. My voice was as steady as it had been the day I opened that envelope in the garage. "You had a wife who spent 24 years finding things people had hidden inside 100,000 pages of paperwork. And you thought she'd never find one bank statement in her own garage." He didn't have an answer. There wasn't one. And I wished him well in the small, tired way you can mean it about someone who used to be your whole life, and I hung up, and I did not carry him with me after that. Life did not become perfect the moment the papers were signed. Real life never does. There were weeks the grief came back at odd hours. Not grief for Gerald, but grief for the 22 years, for the version of my life I'd believed I was living. There were nights I lay awake angry at myself for how long I'd let it go on, for every reasonable-sounding compromise that had slowly handed my own life to someone who was quietly dismantling it. But peace came, a little more each month, and I've learned that peace is worth more than victory. I sold the house, too many rooms full of a marriage that had never been real, and bought a small place of my own outside Flagstaff, up where the air is thin and the pines go on forever, and the first snow comes early. There's a room there that's just an office, with a desk and good light, And I do consulting work now for a logistics firm that was thrilled to find a retired officer who can spot the one number in a spreadsheet that doesn't belong. It turns out the exact skill that ended my marriage is a skill people will pay very well for. Marisol and I are closer than we've ever been. She says the whole ordeal changed how she does her own work, that she can't look at a client's finances anymore without thinking of the accounts hidden inside her mother's marriage, and that she's caught 2 hidden asset situations for her own clients since, because she knew what to look for. She learned it from the worst year of my life. I like to think something good came out of it that way, passed from me to her, the way the important things get passed down. People ask me sometimes whether I regret the years I gave to a marriage that turned out to be a lie. I don't. Not because they were good years. I know now that they weren't what I thought, but because regret is just one more way of letting Gerald live in my head rent-free, and I evicted him a while ago. What I do carry, and what I'd hand to you if I could, is what I learned. Here it is. The people who plan to take everything from you are counting on exactly one thing, that you will never look, that you'll be too trusting, too tired, too eager to keep the peace, too willing to hand over the paperwork and call it love. They build their whole scheme on your averted eyes. So look at the statements, read what you sign, ask the question that doesn't add up, and then go find the answer, even when you're afraid of it, even when finding it means learning something unbearable about someone you loved. And if you ever find yourself standing in a cold garage with an envelope in your hand that you almost threw away, open it. Because sometimes the whole truth of your life is sitting in a water-stained box against the wall, waiting for the one person brave enough to finally take a look. I almost didn't, and opening it was the best thing I ever did. Thank you for spending this time with me. If any part of Susan's story reached something you've lived through, or someone you love who keeps being told they're imagining things, I'd be honored if you shared it with them. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever found a small thing that turned out to change everything? And if you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, hard truths, and the courage it takes to finally look, I hope you'll subscribe and join me again. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people who've truly earned a place in your life.